You're tuned into the hottest paranormal life show on YouTube, Into the Fringe, where we discuss lost civilizations, UFOs, cryptids, unsolved mysteries, megalithic structures, extraterrestrials, interdimensional portals, time skips, and more. Don't change that channel, because now you are leaving the mainstream and entering into the fringe.
One day I asked a friend of mine who works on an Emmy Award-winning television series if he believed in UFOs. He said, I certainly did when I was in Korea. He said, I was stationed as a sentry in some mountains, and all of a sudden he was alone, and he noticed coming over the horizon a fleet of solid disc craft floating over, and they floated directly overhead and went to the other side. And what he told me was, he said this was very interesting. He said he had a feeling that these craft were from the future. He didn't say from outer space. He said he just got a feeling that they were from the future. And that struck me as pretty interesting, but because I hadn't really heard that espoused before. But then comes along Marc Davenport, who has written a book about the visitors from time, and really giving this serious thought that perhaps the UFO origin is from the future. So tonight we have two great speakers. We have Tom Nicholl, who is the Kansas State Director for the Mutual UFO Network. He's a mechanical engineer. And we have Marc Davenport, who studied chemical engineering and is a professional manufacturing engineer and author of Visitors from Time. So without having any further, I'd like to put the show over to Tom Nicholl, please. Let me know if you can't hear me when I yell. I've had a lot of hobbies in my life, and UFOs kind of found me. It was strictly an accident. If anybody said that I knew anything about UFOs beforehand, I'd say they were silly. I did talk to two people that said, yeah, I guess we saw one, but that's it. But when you have one that's real loud and clear, I say loud, not in a true sense because it's absolute silence, but when you see one so clearly and you know they exist, the good part about it is that you don't ever have to listen to anybody telling you anything that they don't exist, or anybody saying, well, that could have been this or could have been that or something. You know, when you're at that point, you know that they do exist, and there's all the trash and all the static is gone from anything that you read, you listen to, or talk to. So that makes it a nice advantage over anybody that just that picks up this information on the side. And frankly, if my family and some neighbors hadn't seen it at the same time, first of all, I've been divorced. The family would probably think I'm a nut, and the neighbors would be sure. So, what happened? And perfect conditions. Sun was at our back, 10-15 minutes before sundown. We were facing the east, and our son-in-law, what is that up there, out to the north of us? And we're looking straight east, and here to the north was this brilliant red-orange light. Well, I've been around welding for 14 years, and around arc welding, and frankly, this was a lot brighter than anything I'd ever seen, and especially at that distance. So I ran to get a telescope, and I called for a daughter to get a pair of binoculars. I was so shaken up that I knew where the binoculars were, but I couldn't tell her. I also walked right by 7 cameras. I didn't pick up one of them. One of them was loaded with movie film. Now this is not uncommon, because by the way, I've learned since then that there's many people goes out to look for UFOs, and they have a camera hung around their neck, sitting on the top of the car, and never take a picture. But anyway, so when we
got the binoculars and telescope, and you can see that this is a disc, a metallic one. And it's flat on the bottom, and it's curved on the top like part of a sphere. And when you can see it clearly like this, along the trailing edge with three red-orange lights around the trailing edge. And it was going through space like it was on a long wave, like in a quartering sea, and which it would turn up like this, and when it tilted a little bit, you could see brown or green reflections off the ground. So that's if you say that, why then, hey, maybe this thing is somewhere plus or minus a few hundred feet or close to 500 feet off the ground. And it was probably 1,000 feet plus or minus 200 or 300 feet. That's the best guesses we could have. But here we see this going through the air. It's about the speed of a small plane. Now when you see it going that small, you had time to pass the binoculars around, take a quick look through the telescope. Looking through the telescope is a little difficult because you're picking up such a small field that you have a tough time holding it on there to see it. But in the telescope, you could see vapor going up to the top, like it's coming from the edges of it, like it might have been hot or whatever, went up to the top, went with it, and it didn't trail. Now, if you have vapor that doesn't trail when you're going 100 miles an hour, I want to see it. Now, there's nothing about this that makes any sense. Nothing we know would fly under those conditions. We don't know anything that has vapor coming out of it that's going to go straight up. All is moving through the air. So, and I was able to see it at the very end. Went on further south, and then over farmland, watching it, and a puff of smoke, the white stuff shot down, and two heavy pieces, two black things went down to the ground. I have no idea what happened. All I can tell you is what I saw. And I reported it to the WDAF TV. They said it. I said, hear any reports? He says, no. Oh. Switchboard's lighting up like a Christmas tree. He said, I'll call you. Took my name, and that was the last I ever heard of him. Called the Johnson County Sheriff. Sheriff got the report. Eventually came out to the house. And he went to a neighbor's house instead of ours. And he told the neighbor that he had 25 reports. Comes to our house, talks to my wife because I'm gone, and tells them that, hey, nobody reported. Why would the sheriff tell the neighbor that there were 25 and tell us none but ours? All right. So then I also called Richard Scavauer, which is his base. Oh, we broke the machinery. Anyway, took me about flip it off. I got it. You want to stay in? Now, okay, can you hear me? Richard Scavauer, I called them to report this because their tower could have seen it because they were in between me and the UFO was between me and the Richard Scavauer tower. And at one time I would guess we were pretty close to halfway. It was. And I reported, of course, if you get the officer of the day and go through the normal routine, about 5-10 minutes, they found, oh yeah, we got a forum for that. It turns out it's 5 pages long, and where you were born and all this good stuff. So you have flat feet, I guess everything else you can think of. But anyway, so I got in the car and went out back and forth across the farmland. The roads were about a mile apart at that point because it was all owned by one man. And couldn't find anything. Nobody had seen it. Zip. So I got back. I just called in a bit, and here a call came in from Richard Scavauer. I said, well, there were no planes in the area at the time and no blips on radar. Click. Hung up before you ask any questions or say anything. So, nothing happened. Nothing further. And every time, I say for the next 2-3 weeks or so that I have lunch with somebody, I say, tell me the story. Finally, one of the fellows that got me into the Navy like years ago, he said, why don't you go and talk to the skipper over at the Navy base, since you knew them and since you worked on some highly secret devices for the bomb sites during the war. I said, fine. So anyway, I got a hold of him, and to make a long story short, he said, through a channel, so I should go talk to the general at Richard Stabauer. Got a hold of his assistant, and full colonel said, we'll have somebody out there. And in fact, we came out the next Saturday. We went through where it was, all the details about this. And my wife asked him and said, do you believe in UFOs? He said, yes, I've had to chase them. And as he left, he said, if you don't hear from me in about 2 weeks, give me a call. Well, 2 weeks I hadn't heard, so I gave him a call. I said, have you heard anything about this UFOs? He says, no, you won't either. That was the end of that one. So you can't get anything quicker than anybody to shut up quicker about that than the treatment I've gotten. So the reason I'm bringing this up is, hey, this is my first experience with UFO, and this is the cover-up by whatever agencies in the government that I ran into. Went further. I talked to and wrote several letters, information to our Congressman Larry Wynn, and we corresponded back and forth, and finally, after I guess it must maybe 6 months or more, he got a letter from the liaison officer that works between Congress and the Air Force, and this man, who was a colonel, and he had given a letter about my case to the congressman. The congress said, I don't think you're going to like this, but it was a re-evaluation. Now, I never heard about the first re-evaluation, but there were 2 re-evaluations of my report, and there was a laundry bag, plastic laundry bag with a candle in it. That's about a quick kiss off and shut up dumb thing, because if I hadn't had 1,000 hours in the air of the pilot, and if I hadn't seen every type of storm and thing that you could think of, from hurricanes to St. Elmo's fire to inverted thunderheads and everything that you can think of in the skies, and my major was in aeronautical engineering. Somebody tell me, the laundry bag, because we made it, when we were kids, we made those out of paper. And we put candles, or we put kerosene lights in it and shoot the flow away and hope it didn't burn down your neighbor's house. But anyway, so what I'm saying is, this is my experience, first time, and this is the kind of the shut-off I got. And time went on, and I did join NICAP. I sent my report into NICAP, and through that I got contacted with Jim McDonald and Dr. Heineck, and some real neat people in this field, some real sharp people, and some people that had a lot of study of it. I'm just a neophyte at this thing at this point. But eventually, I'd say within a couple of years of our sighting, which was in 1967, Dr. Cardinal had been given $400,000 for the Air Force to analyze, study the UFO phenomenon. Well, I don't know if you ever read about Dr. Cardinal came out with a report like this. He dragged it on for 1 year. It was supposed to have been $400,000. Then he got it up to another 150, 250. In other words, he dragged it out for about 3 years, as I recall, and more money, of course. But if it wasn't for the fact that when I was working on this bomb site for this bombing system for the Navy, I was working for his department indirectly. Well, directly, I should say. Because my unit was assigned to the National Bureau of Standards, of which he was in charge of. He was the head of it. So here I said, hey, at least I was able to talk to this guy. So I called him. He was at I think, at the University of Colorado. And after 4 calls, I got into it. And I told him about it, and I said, look, you give me 4 men and a boy and magnetometers and whatever, and I said, we can find it. We can find the remains of this thing. He goes, well, this is the toughest job I ever had. I can't get any information. And so I'm giving it to you right here in the handbasket. I said, here's a crash case, in my opinion. I said, I can't prove it, but I think there is. So, I said, now, for God's sakes, you're flying back and forth all over the country. You certainly could come into Kansas City for 5 minutes. I said, I'll even buy you a tired hot dog. We had lunch or something at the airport. I don't care. I said, you remember Parkey? Parkey happened to be the guy I worked for. He said, yeah. I said, I remember it because you asked for one of my reports. That's how I remember the whole this thing. Well, anyway, zip. But it's interesting that I went to a MUFON meeting about 4 or 5, maybe 3 or 4 years after that, and Dr. Dave Saunders gave a talk. Dave Saunders worked for Cardinal, and so did another fellow, and they wrote a book about how poorly the handling of UFO cases by the Cardinal report, Cardinal people. So that he wrote this other saying, UFOs, yes, and I don't know what the rest of the title was. But he had the printout. He had 70,000 printouts on the computer taken from the Cardinal reports of the ones that they were studying. And to say nothing, and since then he's gotten over, I suppose, about 120,000. But anyway, I looked, opened it up, here's my report. Because Dr. Cardinal said that he is supposed to get all the reports in from anywhere in the Air Force or wherever. And he told me on the phone that as soon as it came in, he would give me a call. Well, of course, he never called. But here I found my report, but it was by a phone call to Dr. Cardinal. It never gone through the circuit of the military. I'll just give you something to help shut off this. We're going to show you a few slides. I'm going to have to go rather rapidly because my time's been cut down by whatever we started with. But as I've been in this field, let's say I've been about 27 years. Well, in this, where a lot of people ask, hey, they say, for one thing, I don't see anything in the papers these days. Well, I'll tell you, they're not reading. They're not looking at it. But, for example, how many saw the article about the 6-mile diameter UFO over China? How many saw that? Nobody. 3 years ago, that was in the paper. Kansas City Star. All right, and how many heard about the Japanese cargo plane pilot that saw one about the size of 2 football fields over Alaska? How many saw that one? 2. Now these were in our papers, our major newspapers, and I have to admit that I have to read the Kansas City Star because that's where I live. I don't know how many heard about the reports that in Russia, when they really broke up the Soviet Union, they sent out information to the people, hey, we want reports on UFOs. Whatever you know about. The first month, they got 36,000 cases. That's a pretty good number. And during that, by the way, the MUFON was in contact with the Russian, who was in trained the cosmonauts, and I can't think of his name. He's since died. But anyway, we had contact, and we had tapes from him, and we translated it and so on. He sent us 20 cases that happened in Russia. One of which they saw one that was 2,500 feet diameter. And also, as you're living in this field, you have to ask the questions. You just don't stand around and look at a wall. But for example, I like to always ask questions of pilots. Having been one line, I'd like to hear what they have to say. And it's amazing how many will open up if you get them off to the side or hold a confidential position. They sometimes think that you're part of the Air Force or somebody knows into their business. But anyway, for example, it wasn't too long ago, I was in Chicago, and waiting, flights were going to be delayed. I had a chance to talk to the pilots, and I said, why haven't you guys seen the UFOs? Well, I suppose you believe that, but you wouldn't have asked the question. I said, I sure do, because I saw one loud and clear. And then they looked at me and looked at me again, and I talked a little bit more about flying or whatever. Pretty soon the guy said, okay, I'll tell you my experience. And there's 3 of them in the cockpit, and 2 of them had separate experiences with different crews. One of which, he said, well, we were over Kansas at night, and we could see 3 red-orange lights ahead of us. And we thought we were looking down the tailpipes of some Navy fighter planes or something like that. And he says, boy, we got that grew away, all of a sudden they shot in all different directions so fast, it was impossible to say how fast they were going. The other fellow, he said we were on a flight to the West Coast, we had to stop once or twice, maybe Albuquerque, Phoenix, or something like this, and we picked up one on the right-hand wing, and as we were going to land, by that thing would disappear. Then we'd come back up in the air, and that thing would show up again on our wing, and every now and then, and move around to the other wing. And they did that on the 2 landings and 2 takeoffs. I like to fish. I fished down in Florida, and after fishing with my brother, we were doing a lousy job of catching fish. So I finally, after some time, we decided to get a guide. Who shows up? The guy that had been in the special services in the Air Force, retired. So I had to ask him that question. He said, yeah. He says he and 18 fellows were being transported from Oahu to Guam. And this was in the last 5 years. And he said, broad daylight, where this thing came up on the right-hand side, a big cylindrical shaped thing, and we took pictures of it, and the thing came around on the other side, took pictures of it. 6 fellows on board that had a camera, and all 6 of them were taking pictures. And he said that then he got up ahead of it, went to the skies fast, and disappeared instantaneously, almost. He said, no, I said, hey, how big was this thing? Oh, about over 200 feet. It's good, you know. And he said, I said, well, first of all, what was the shape of it? It was cylindrical, like a cigar. And he said, I said, now, I've seen some pictures. I told him, I said, I've seen pictures of some of these that are on an angle. Was it in line with the axis of the flight? Yeah, it was down at that kind of an angle. He said, as soon as we landed in Guam, there was somebody there that picked up all of our cameras, took all of our film, didn't say a thing, gone. Let me go ahead and look for it. There's a friend of mine in Kansas City, I can't name him, but he was an officer, a photographic officer, and he worked in the Blue Book. You would know about that. That's supposedly where a lot of this stuff on UFOs went. Okay. Hey, he said he processed thousands of feet of gun camera film during the Korean War. And as soon as he finished processing, some 2 men came in from Washington with handcuffs on a briefcase, and off they went with the film. So anyway, so you ask these questions, that's what you get. Let me show you some pictures. I'm going to go through very rapidly. Mainly because time is short. Now this fellow was the first one that really started all this stuff about UFOs because he's with Ken Arnold, and he was a former Air Force pilot, but he had his own plane. He saw 9 of them under him on 1947, and by the way, within a week to 9 days after this, a crash occurred of 2 UFOs in Arizona, and you'll hear more about that later. Go ahead. Next. This was one taken by military, and I think it was taken by the Canadian Air Force. This is the moon, by the way. They say it's off to the right-hand side. Next. One of the problems with UFO studies, and by the way, MUFON is, and everything, everybody, investigators and everybody connected with it are volunteers. There's no money in it, there's no rewards with it. Hey, we believe in it, we're trying to find it and learn about it as a hobby. And one of the toughest ones is to find out what goes on as far as light is concerned. You see that in the middle of the night, and you've got so many reports like this, and what can you tell about it? It'd be nice if you could take pictures of it with diffraction grading, take pictures of it with special cameras, and get some distances and angles and so on. Dr. Rutledge, down at the University of Southeast Missouri State, has made some studies of these various things. He and I were on a radio program, and one of the two things that I'd ask him, because we hear this so often, and we kind of get indulged with it. But one is that a farmer will see a UFO out in the back 40, and he sees this bright light, and cattle have been making noises, and he wakes up at 2:30 in the morning. And here light comes out of this thing, and it telescopes and steps down to the ground. Who knows how to make a light do that? So I asked him about that. And I said, have you seen that? He said, yes. He's seen it, and he says he's trying to get the pictures of it through diffraction grading, and he had several different methods. He wanted to find out, first of all, if this was air that was being ionized, or whether it was another material coming out of, or was it in this plasma of some kind. Okay, next. This is an island off Brazil. This is a blow-up of this, and it was taken by the Brazilian Navy. Next. So I have to go kind of fast. This was taken by the Royal Canadian Air Force. This thing was going faster than they were. They were trying to set up an east-west coast record with the 3 planes. Next. This is our own plane, and this thing followed around a very extensive trip. Ended up here, the plane landed in Forbes, and next picture shows the blow-up of that, the UFO, and these are the bright lights, whether they're trading lights or not, I don't know. But as again, remember, these are second, third generation copies of pictures, and obviously, if I had taken them, they'd been a lot better. Mansville, Ohio. Helicopter crew flying to Cleveland at night. Next. This is the crew. They were National Guard. Next. This is what they described it, but they saw coming at them on a collision course from the right, and all of a sudden they went into a dive to avoid it and tried to put it down to like 2,000 feet a minute, and the next thing they knew, the light came all through the cabin, a green light, they couldn't even see the instruments. Finally, after about 15 minutes, this UFO left them, and they were 3,500 feet higher than they were. Now they put them in a dive and they're higher. Okay, next. This is a photo of one of many that lost his life chasing one. I think he crashed in somewhere in Kentucky. Next. Farmer out here in McMinnville. Next. He took this with a low systematic camera. And we can't, everybody that's tested this film, I've heard some real super experts say, hey, this is real. Pardon the spots, but that's picked up for the storage of the film. Next. Blow up of it. This is what it looks like, and if you can, there's an exact copy. It looks like exactly the same thing come out of Paris. Yes, next. Now, if you saw this going around through the sky, and you're an astronomer, it'd be pretty hard to figure out what in the devil that would be. We don't know any comets that would do this in a short period of time. We don't know of any meteors, planetoids, asteroids, nothing will make a trip like that. Next. This is probably the closest to what we saw. And here's a little light here and light here, and this light bouncing off the top of it. I can't tell you what that little white flare up there is, but again, this was a storage problem on the film. Next. Now this is a while. Experts have looked at this film. This was taken in Oregon. And why we're going to get 3 different images on this, I don't know. Next. These 2 fellows, fishermen, they were picked up, taken on board, and examined, put back on the beach where they were fishing. Next. Picked up, they didn't touch the ground. Next. He looked into an object, he drew this, he thinks it was something like this. Next. This is what he thinks they look like. Look like a couple guys around here, I think. Next. This little girl up in Iowa saw a UFO come off of this field right across the street from them. Next. Coming from the air, this soybean was dehydrated and it didn't grow for 4 years. Nothing grew there. Everything was treated the same way. Finally got back and forth over it. Next. Betty and Barney Hill. Now they were one of the first real cases that's been documented and so forth about abduction, and they, I'm trying to think of the book, Fuller wrote the book. Anyway, interrupted time, and they lost 2 hours of time, which is just almost typical. Next. This young man was in a shed. Dog made a lot of noise. Some sheep made noise. And this was in Delphus. It's not too far from here. Next. He was in a shed like this. This thing came over his head and looked up and it was red, and he was blinded for I don't know how long, but not many, several minutes at least. The dog was blinded for about 2 weeks. And it broke a limb off the tree here, knocked down a tree over here, and next. Here's a limb that was broken, next. And here was this circle. His mother came out at night and noticed that this glowed. She picked it up with her fingers, and the fingers became numb. And would you believe, 10 months later, Dr. Harder from the University of California came out and did the same thing, and his fingers became numb. Now, the mother's fingers were numb for several months, but they finally went away. However, there's one little place she scratched her leg, and that's still numb, last I heard. Next. The snow wouldn't melt. It would not go into the surface. It laid on the top, the cause of the next slide. This is the soil taken outside the ring, and this is the ring soil, and it will not absorb the moisture. Next. Now this is down there, this is the Cash Landrum case, which is this woman with her daughter driving and a grandson. Came around the corner. Next. This is north of Houston. And this thing was sitting on the road, and they had to obviously stopped very quickly, and they all got out to look at whatever it was, and then pretty soon the older woman and young boy, about 12 years old, jumped back in the car. The other gal stayed out there a little bit longer. She got back in later, and the steering wheel was so hot that she couldn't touch it, and they have, I don't know what time period it was, but they became nauseous, vomited, and eventually lost hair. The next picture, I think we might see. This is another picture, a view of it. Hey, a bunch of helicopters came around it. Next. This is I think this is the older one, and this is the boy. Next. And you can see she's lost hair here. Next. And some more. And a lesion on her hand. Next. Next. This is a kind of a typical UFO landing trace case, of which we have probably over 5,000 of them. This friend of mine, 10 films. has collected over 5,000 such cases where people have seen UFOs come up from it and have left something. That's not a true crop circle, that's what we're talking about. But this is the reeds above are dehydrated, there's water down below, and then it's kept intact, just like they were originally. Now I'm going to call it quits on this one, because we're running out of time. But anyway, we'll have question and answer after the next speaker. If you have any questions, we'll save them then, or unless I'll take one real quick one right now. Anybody have one? Do you have more slides to show us? Oh, I've got quite a few more, but I just don't have time. The part that I have, other than Barney Hill, I didn't even touch the abduction cases, because this is a whole new field of which they're just coming out of the woodwork. Apparently, from the last survey, there's something like 3 million people believe have been abducted. I thank you.
And test it. If they found out it was aluminum, throw that away. That's no good. It's aluminum. I don't know why they assumed that it had to be something that couldn't be produced on the Earth, because after all, there's aluminum on the moon, there's aluminum on the other planets. But they did assume that for a long time. Next slide. A lot of people assumed that good photographs had to be fakes. Consequently, a lot of photographs have never even been studied. But unfortunately, that leaves out all of Billy Meyer's photos. I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, but if you're not, you should see the photos. He has a lot of photos that are as clear as this or more clear. Steven Spielberg has looked at some of his photos and said, yes, we can reproduce those. It'll cost about $50,000 a shot to do it. And they're made by a one-armed farmer. This particular one is not. This is gun camera film. Yeah, he's a one-armed farmer, and he's poor, and he lives out in Switzerland by himself. He goes out in the woods on a motorcycle and shoots these things. I don't think he has a studio at $50,000 a shot. This particular one is not one of Meyer's. This was gun camera film from an Air Force plane. It was taken in 1966 by Air Force personnel. And I have lots of them put away in different places in case one of the Air Force people wants to come and take this one. I have a lot of copies of it. Finally, a lot of them assume that all things metaphysical and spiritual had to throw them out. I mentioned that once before. I think that's a mistake. They're still doing that. Donald Ware was recently asked to leave the board of directors of the Mutual UFO Network because he was trying to convince the other board members that the human spirit and the channeling, that these people who say they're channeling information from up there somewhere, he was trying to convince them that is worthy of scientific study. They said, no, it's not. We don't want to listen to it. So they fired him. And this is typical of the way people have thought. So we got to think bigger. We've got to think bigger than we've been thinking. Because what these people were doing by arbitrarily eliminating data like this was they were trying to put a jigsaw puzzle together after throwing away all those square-sided pieces. Have you ever tried to do that? Kind of like trying to study nuclear engineering before you take arithmetic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about another thing that is kind of like that too. Everyone was collecting anecdotal data. Everyone was going out into the field and collecting page after page after page of documentation, photographs, measurements, soil samples, and they were bringing them back and putting them into file cabinets, and nobody was looking at them. At least this is the way it appears at the time. Nobody was analyzing that data. We had mountains of data, and nobody was really looking at it to see what conclusions they could draw. Everybody was concentrating on three big questions. Next slide. Who are they? Next. Where do they come from? Next. Why are they here? Three big questions. Everybody was concentrating on that. Nobody was concentrating on the little questions, the prerequisite questions, as I consider them. How are they able to travel at 40,000 miles an hour right through our atmosphere without burning up, without making any noise, without breaking up? And how can they, at speeds like that, suddenly turn 180 degrees instantaneously without just becoming rubble? And how could pilots be inside these things when they do that without just turning to bloody pulp? You know? If we tried to do that with any of our stuff, the machinery would not survive. How are they able to hover noiselessly, without any sound at all, without any air currents, without disturbing leaves or anything else, and then just shoot off at 100,000 miles an hour or something so fast that we can't even detect it? In other words, it makes a streak on a single film. And I'll show you some films later. Well, Tom showed you a slide where there were three separate images on one shot of film. And the film was shot at something like 1/250th of a second. So how can they do this? How can they materialize and disappear and change shape? Next slide. This is one frame of a video camcorder. And the next slide, that's the next frame. I mean, I don't know how fast that is. It's a fraction of a second. It's changed from a double image into a single image in that amount of time. Also, how are they able to radiate electromagnetic radiation at all different frequencies? We're talking about the full range of frequencies, from the lowest frequency of radio waves up through microwaves and heat and light of all different colors and ultraviolet and X-rays and gamma rays, the full range. We have measured these radiations coming from the hulls of these ships. Now they do often have lights where they shine lights, you know, and you can see lights of different colors coming from actual what appear to be light fixtures, like the headlights of your car. But they also radiate these things from the hulls of their ships. How do they do that? How do they accomplish that? Why are good close-up photographs so rare? I showed you a photo that was pretty good though there, but most photos, next slide, most photos are like this. Well, it could be anything. It could be a bird, a fat bird, but a bird. Very few of them are like this one that I showed you. The next slide. The next slide. Very few of them are this clear. So why is that? Why is it so hard? Tom talked about a lot of people who have cameras and are there and they don't take the pictures. But there are also an awful lot of pictures that are taken, people are this close and they snap a picture, and when they get home and develop the film, they either have a blob or they have nothing, or they have something that doesn't look anything like what they saw with their eyes. Why are they sometimes seen on radar and not visually? There have been instances where pilots have said, I see a UFO, and they call the tower and say, I've got a bogey up here right in front of me. And the tower says, sorry, I don't see it. And they say, well, it's only 50 feet in front of me, but I don't see it. And then the UFO will wink out, and the pilot says, uh-oh, I lost it. And the tower says, now we've got it. It's 50 feet in front of you. So how is it that they're able to do this? They either are there or they're not, right? Well, maybe not. And also, why the government cover-up? So not answering these little questions first was, as I say, like trying to study nuclear physics without taking arithmetic first. It appeared to me that also ufologists were subconsciously restricting their thinking. Everybody had a pet theory. One guy says that these things are all from planet X. And another guy says, no, these are from the hollow earth, from the inside of the earth. Another guy says, well, they're all from some other dimension. And somebody else says, no, they're all angels, or they're demons, or they're atmospheric animals, or they're earthquake lights. And so they would all collect data that would support their own theory. And they would say, see all this data? This is my theory. This is what they are. But if you say, well, what about all these other ones? They say, well, I don't know about those other ones. So nobody seemed to be saying, slide. Nobody seems to be saying that some of them are from Planet X. In this case, Planet X is Mars. That's a place on Mars there. That's a NASA photo. And others are from Planet Y. Slide. And others are from 100,000 or a million or a billion other planets and other dimensions, and some of them might be angels and so on and so forth. In other words, the phenomenon may be so complex that it's made up of lots and lots and lots of different phenomena. And I believe that's what we're looking at here. Even after you separate out all the hoaxes and misperceptions of common objects and hallucinations and everything, you're left with data that indicates that there's more than one phenomenon here. Also, people were ignoring obvious patterns. Next slide. Most of the occupants were humanoid, as I said. I get a lot of these. People send me these in the mail all the time. This particular one is interpreted as a dream. A lot of people paint similar or draw similar things for me, and they say it's not a dream. They recall it consciously. This may turn out not to be a dream after hypnosis, but as you see, even though there are lots of different creatures here, they're all humanoid. They all have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 1 head, everything. They're humanoid. That's a pattern. Another pattern is when we track UFOs on film, when people see them traveling at night and they see the lights, and when they're doing these violent maneuvers, when they make a 180-degree turn, quite often there would be a color change. So they come along, they're green, and they make this turn, and then they're yellow, or they're blue, or red. Another pattern, I think, that's been overlooked, the so-called electromagnetic effects. They stop cars. They can fly over your car, and your car just goes dead. They can powerfail cities. They can make equipment stop working when they fly over. Also, occupants are often asked questions like, what time is it? What is time? What is your time? What is a year? What is age? As if they don't know what time is. And time is often distorted in or near UFOs. People are often taken for rides that last an hour, and when they come back, they find out that 5 days have passed. Now, how does this happen? Clocks and watches are often stopped when they're in the vicinity of a UFO, or when people wear their watch inside the UFO and they come back, the clocks can stop, they can run backwards, they can jump ahead, way far ahead in time. There's something wrong with time here. So when I put these 3 big questions aside, that who are they, why are they here, and where are they from, when I put those aside and started looking at the little questions, I came up with what I believe is a simple, single, testable hypothesis that can explain just about all of these things. Next slide. And this is where I put it. And it's for sale over here if you want to look at it. First, I looked at the so-called electromagnetic effects. You're driving in your car late at night, you're way out in the middle of nowhere, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you see this light, and it starts following you. And you don't think anything of it until it gets closer, and it's still following you. And it's not flying like an airplane, it's funny. And it comes still closer, and your headlights start to dim. And the thing comes and lands in front of you, and before you can do anything, your engine quits, and your radio goes off, and you're sitting there, and your car is dead, and you're sitting there with your mouth open, looking at a flying saucer in front of you. Now, this happens quite often. These things have the ability to powerfail not only cars, but machinery. There's a case where in Kuwait, a long time before Desert Storm, the automatic oil pumping equipment went off when one of these things flew over. And the equipment just was dead, the oil stopped flowing. This happens lots of times. In South America, there have been many cases where a UFO was flown over and the whole city, all the lights in the city went out. If you saw the movie Close Encounters, you saw a representation of this. Now, the common theory, up until recently, the common theory to explain that is that these UFOs are just big magnets, and they're revolving. And the reason they're revolving is they're spinning is to keep them from flipping over and coming down. And people think that maybe they travel along the Earth's magnetic lines of force. But I have a problem with that because tests have been done To begin with, the car bodies would actually be bent if you had a magnet strong enough to do that, to stop your car and turn your lights off for any length of time. The metal would actually be bent. It would have residual magnetism left in it that you could detect later. You'd be able to take a magnetometer and go up there, and you could take a compass and go up next to the thing, and the compass would just go crazy. Electrical components would be blown out. Any car that had this field close enough to it to stop the engine and turn the lights off, the radio would just be fried. The little field effect transistors and integrated circuits, but we don't find that. And we don't find bent metal in the cars, and we don't find residual magnetism. But the most important thing is the car would not start by itself when the UFO left. And they do sometimes. Sometimes when people are sitting there with their mouths still open, the thing will leave, and the car will come back on by itself. And if it's still in gear, sometimes it'll even start down the highway again, and the person has to grab a hold of the steering wheel. The oil pumping equipment I mentioned a while ago, that came on by itself, even though it is designed to not be able to start it by itself for safety reasons. People have to go, technicians, several of them, have to go to different places and turn switches on manually to start it again. Nevertheless, when the UFO left, the equipment came on by itself and the oil pumped again. The South American cases I told you about, where the power grid, the whole power grid went on, came on by itself. But the people at the power company are scratching their heads because they don't know how that could happen. Because once again, the system is designed, once it goes off, that it has to be restarted manually from several different places. And not only did they not restart it, but none of the fuses blew. And they couldn't figure out how that happened, because if you had the power off for any length of time in a certain place, and it came back on without being restarted manually, they knew for sure that it would blow the fuses, but it didn't. So maybe the temporal anomalies that have been reported and the UFO occupants' preoccupation with time, asking all these questions about time, maybe those are clues, and maybe the assumption that these are electromagnetic effects is the wrong assumption. Maybe they are temporal time effects. Now I'm going to give you a physics lesson, so try not to go to sleep here. I always did when people told me stuff like this. According to the theory of relativity, and this is, Albert Einstein came up with this in 1905, space and time are interdependent, and together they form a four-dimensional continuum that we call space-time, and the presence of matter warps the space-time continuum. Now, the more mass is involved, the greater the curvature, the greater the warping of space-time. Now, when we have something that's called a black hole, this is a star that's collapsed in on itself, and the mass is so great that a teaspoon full of it weighs 1 billion tons. When we have something that's that massive, it can actually warp space-time inside out, turn it clearly inside out, and so that time runs backwards in this area that's called a singularity, a black hole. Now, what I propose is that these UFOs, we know that these things possess a technology that's much higher than ours. They're much more advanced than anything that we have. What I propose is that their technology is so advanced that they have figured out how to produce the same effect that a black hole produces. They have figured out how to warp space-time inside out without breaking up or having their ship torn into individual atoms or anything else. They have some kind of a generator that produces a field around their ship that warps space-time so that inside that field, inside their own private little bubble, their own private little universe, the laws of physics are not the same as they are in our universe. They're never actually in our universe. They're in their own little private one. So that when they're traveling through the sky, and they look to us like they're traveling at 40,000 miles an hour, they may only be traveling at 40 miles an hour to them. The space-time that they're in is not the same space-time that we're in. That's what I'm proposing. If that's the case, if they can produce this field, and maybe they don't have a machine, maybe some of these people are so advanced that they can do this with their minds. It's possible. I mean, we know about telekinesis. We know that certain people are able to make little aluminum foil things things spinning with their minds or move cigarette ashes. That's been tested. They've done tests at Stanford and Princeton and other places. Maybe these people are so advanced they can do it with their minds. I think we have evidence that they have some kind of technology, some kind of machine, some kind of generator that can do it. And maybe their time inside their field is running at right angles to ours, so that a second is equal to one of our hours, or even a millisecond is equal to one of our years. And if this is the case, and that field gets close to our cars, maybe it isn't that the electricity is turned off or anything like that. Maybe it's just slowed down to the point where it doesn't work anymore. And if that's the case, wouldn't the car return to normal after the thing left? I mean, provided that all other factors are the same, provided that all the conditions are right. See, we think of time as a river. We think of time as flowing inexorably from the past through the present into the future, and we're like corks in that river, and that we're going to go there no matter what, and there's nothing we can do about it. But the quantum physicists have been telling us, at least since 1980, that that's not the way it is at all. According to them, the flow of time is an artifact of our consciousness. Let me give you some quotes here. This is from Dr. Paul Davies, who is a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, England, a lecturer in applied mathematics at King's College, University of London, and visiting fellow at the Institute of Astronomy, Cambridge, England. In other words, this guy is no slouch. In a book called Other Worlds, published by Simon & Schuster in 1980, he writes, and I quote, "There seems to be no strong reason for supposing that the flow of time is any more than an illusion produced by the brain processes similar to the perception of rotation during dizziness." In other words, it's our own brain that's creating the illusion of the passage of time. He goes on to write, "The concept of elastic time was quite a shock when Einstein introduced it in 1905, but since then many experiments have confirmed its reality. A good check on the effect was made at CERN in Geneva in early 1977. It confirmed the amount of time dilation predicted by the theory of relativity to an accuracy of 0.2%. One intriguing possibility opened up by the time dilation effect is time travel. By approaching closer and closer to the speed of light, an astronaut can dislocate his time scale more and more violently relative to the rest of the universe. For example, rocketing to within 100 miles per hour of the speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per hour, he can accomplish a journey to the nearest star in less than 1 day, though the same journey measured from Earth takes over 4 years. His clock rate is thus about 1,800 times slower than when observed from Earth, than when observed from the rocket." He goes on to say, time dilation is definitely science fact. Next slide, please. In this book, Dr. Fred Alan Wolf, who is another highly respected physicist, he published this in 1988 by Universe Seminars, later by Simon & Schuster, which you see here. Dr. Wolf says, as strange as it appears at first glance, time machines, devices that enable a conscious being to travel in time backward and forward, must be constructible if parallel worlds exist. He says, assuming that the general theory of relativity is correct, then time machines and parallel universes must exist. Massive objects confined to small regions of space produce curves in space-time. Curving space-time introduces gravitational distortion, and such distortion creates parallel universes and time machines. Time machines can be constructed consistent with the laws of quantum physics and general relativity, provided parallel universes indeed exist. The existence of parallel universes, those that appear as a result of the observance of any physical system according to the quantum rules, makes it possible to communicate with both the past and the future through the actions of the quantum wave of probability. It turns out this wave can travel forward and backward in time. Now, the translation of that. Quantum physics, which is the new physics that the theoretical physicists are studying in the laboratory right now, tells us that that when we observe something, what we observe affects not only the future, but also the past. When we see something, when we decide something, it affects the future and the past. Time is not what we think it is at all. It is our consciousness. It is the way we think that creates the flow of time. So time travel is possible, and we will learn how to do it at some time in the future, but we're a ways from that now. We don't quite know how this all works yet, but somebody else apparently does. Carol Alley, Oleg Jakubowicz, and William Wicks verified the existence of backward through time travel at the University of Maryland in 1985 when they performed their famous photon experiments. You can read about that in this book. Excuse me. Dr. Frank Tipler, who is professor of physics and mathematics at Tulane University, described how to build a working time machine. And the way he described it was you have to take a bunch of rotating neutron stars and stick them together. Well, we don't know how to do that. We don't have any tools that big yet. I don't think Craftsman sells anything that we can do that with. But nevertheless, he described mathematically what the effects would be if we could do that. And he has proven mathematically that you can travel backwards and forwards through time. Next slide. Could fields that warp space-time explain other possible things that UFOs do? We talked about the speed. They can travel so fast. Well, maybe they're not traveling so fast. It's just that we think they are because we're looking through some kind of a field into a different little universe there. The aerobatics, they can also materialize on the spot. There have been many cases where people have just been standing there and one of these things just forms in front of them. A UFO forms there, and you think, well, that's got to be a hologram or something, you know, it's not real. And then the thing lands and it presses big holes in the pavement. And then people get out of it and take people aboard and they undergo procedures and they're operated on. And after they get out, the thing takes off. It breaks tree branches. Tom showed you some pictures of that. It sets the pavement on fire or the grass or whatever else is there. So if this is a hologram, it's pretty physical for a hologram. People go in and wrap their knuckles on the tables in there. Next photo. This is one of Billy Meyer's photos. I told you about him. You see how on your right, this thing is not exactly symmetrical. It looks like it's kind of warped a little bit. Well, a lot of people thought that was evidence that this photograph was a fake, that he had thrown some kind of a model up and photographed it, and that was an error. You know, but I don't think so. I think it may be evidence that photograph is real, because I think what you may be seeing there is part of that warping of space-time. I'm going to show you some more of that later, some videotape. I talked about these things are able to give off all frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. Now, how can they do that? Assuming that they can warp space-time, how is it that they're able to do that? So I want to talk about something called the Doppler effect. And I want to play a tape for you. It's real short. It won't take long. This is at a racetrack. Notice how when the car is coming toward you, the sound is high-pitched, very high-pitched. And just as it passes you, the sound immediately becomes low-pitched. Been to a racetrack or been to a highway, you've heard this. Did you ever wonder why that was? Okay. The reason for that is sound is emitted in waves like this. We call them sinusoidal waves, just like the waves on an ocean. Now, it's the distance between one peak and the next peak of one of those waves. That is what determines the pitch of a sound. The closer together they are, the higher the pitch. When the thing is coming toward you, between the time it emits one peak and the time it emits the next peak, it's moved. So that has the effect of compressing those waves and making them closer together. They're higher energy waves. As it's moving away from you, it emits one peak, and then a valley, and then as it's moving away, it emits another peak. But it's moved in between, so it has the effect of stretching those waves out. Okay, now sound is not the only wave that is affected this way. Electromagnetic waves are also affected this way. And that includes all of it. All electromagnetic waves are exactly the same except for their wavelength. Radio waves can have a wavelength from one peak to the next, can be thousands of miles between them. On the other end of the spectrum, you go up through radio, what we call radio waves and microwaves and infrared, visible light, which is a tiny little portion of the electromagnetic spectrum right in the middle, and then ultraviolet, and then X-rays, and then gamma rays. All of these waves are exactly the same, except radio waves are 1,000 miles in between them, maybe, or somewhere in there. Gamma rays, there's trillions of them per inch for very high energy. And that's the only difference between them. So if you can change the wavelength, let's say heat is just below visible light on the electromagnetic spectrum. So if you could increase the wavelength of the heat, it would become visible light. As a matter of fact, our scientists, the astronomers, the way they tell how fast something is moving away from us, other galaxies are moving away from us at something like half the speed of light, very, very quickly. The astronomers can tell how fast they're moving away by measuring what they call the redshift, the Doppler effect, but by measuring how the light is stretched out. Those waves are stretched out. And they can tell that. In fact, there's a Dr. William G. Titt of the University of Arizona has even found out recently that the redshift has jumps. In other words, as you go out a certain distance from the Earth, there will be a certain amount of redshift. And when you get to a certain place out there, there'll be a jump and there'll be a whole lot more redshift. And then you'll get to another place and there'll be a jump and there'll be a whole lot more. It's in quanta, just like the shells of an electron. So the universe we're finding out is not what we thought it was at all. Just as the scientists in 1800 said, oh, no, there can't be any such thing as meteorites, as meteors, because everybody knows there aren't any stones in the sky, so how can they fall from the sky? And we're finding out that what we know about the universe now may be just as backward as that was then. So what I'm getting at here is the Doppler effect. If you're inside a field, if you've got a ship and you've produced this field that works space-time, and you're inside the field and somebody else is outside the field, then as radiation passes through that field, it's going to be Doppler. It's going to be changed in wavelength. Just like when you look in a creek and you see a fish, and the fish looks like he's down here, but he's really over there because the light is refracted. Well, the light coming from a UFO is going to be refracted as it goes through that field. So what we see is what is light after it comes out of that field. It may not be what was emitted inside the field at all. In other words, the shape of the ship that we see, this may not be what that thing looks like at all. What we're saying is what got through that field and turned into light of the right wavelength to stimulate our eyes. This could explain how they can disappear, how they can materialize, how they can change shape, because it isn't really the thing changing shape, it isn't the metal changing shape, it's what you see. In fact, we even think that at certain conditions, the field can actually bend the light around the thing so that you see what's behind it, and it can be sitting right in front of you and you wouldn't see it at all because the light is being bent around it. I hope I'm not losing you. So as I studied the existing literature with this hypothesis in mind, I found evidence everywhere. We had UFOs that were surrounded by glows, all different colors, mists. There were clouds that would form. A UFO would form inside of the cloud. We had UFOs that were seen with concentric rings around them. One guy had a pair of Polaroid glasses on. He looked up and saw this thing, and it had these black rings around it, just like this. And he took the Polaroids off, and the thing didn't have the rings. He put it back on there, and they were. It was some kind of a polarization effect that was created by this field around the thing. There was a time when a UFO came down. There were a bunch of people in a restaurant watching a forest fire. A UFO came down and landed in the forest fire. The flames went around it, never touched it, never even got close to it. The people got out of the thing, went and picked up rocks and sticks and everything, put them in bags, got back in the ship and left. They were never in any danger from the fire. The fire never got close to the ship. Invisible barriers like that have been seen on many occasions. In fact, witnesses have even gone up and leaned against these things. There was one guy who was walking up towards this thing slowly because he wasn't sure what it was. He walked up to it, and then he realized, gee, I haven't been walking for a long time. And he realized that he was just kind of stuck in this thing. His nephew saw him and came running up to him and smacked into this field, and it knocked him cold. And here they are 50 feet away from the ship. They're not even close to it yet. We have rocks, bullets, missiles, all sorts of things have been thrown at these things. And not only at the ships, but also at the beings themselves. Betty Andreasen, whom you may have heard, she saw one of these beings when she was a kid. She picked a rock up and threw it at him, and it just kind of slowed down and fell to the ground before it ever hit him. Carl Higdon was hunting elk out in Wyoming. He drew a bead on an elk and took a shot, and the bullet went out at about 50 feet. It slowed to a stop and fell to the ground. They later found the bullet, found out it had been turned inside out, and the ballistics experts, the sheriff, the ballistic experts could not figure out what in the world had happened to that bullet. Well, right after that, he turned over here, and there was an alien being, or some kind of a being, and a spaceship sitting beside him. He was taken inside this ship, and the ship was bigger on the inside than it was on the outside. And this happens frequently. There was a ship that was supposedly captured. A photographer, an Air Force photographer, was flown from Hawaii to California specifically to photograph the thing. He said it was about 30 feet in diameter. He went on the inside. He said, inside we could have thrown a football and not hit the other side. Now this is common. I hear this from lots of people who have been taken aboard these things. They say it landed in my backyard, and their backyard's small. Landed in the backyard, they took me in it, and they took me upstairs and down this hall and down to this other room and then through this room to another room. You know, this thing is huge on the inside, but not on the outside. Well, how can that happen? Well, I think it can happen because I think it's not in our space-time. And I think that's also why they don't stay here very long, because I think it takes a tremendous amount of energy to maintain that field that keeps them here temporarily. We have cases where cars have gone up against these barriers and spun their wheels. If their headlights go out, that's okay. Sometimes their engines die, but sometimes they don't. And when they don't, the cars can be butted up against these fields and spin their wheels and can't go any further. Next slide. This is a photograph that was taken. I'm not sure what the exposure was, but I know it's a tiny fraction of a second. And this is common. You see these things. This is a UFO photograph, and it's moving in a complex movement during that, whatever it is, 125th of a second that shutter is open. There's one from Australia that actually does a figure 8 in one frame of a movie film. We talked about this before. We have cases where people feel paralyzed. I told you about the guy who was no longer walking. Sometimes, if this ship comes down and lands quickly, the person will just be absolutely paralyzed for they don't even know how long. Sometimes there aren't even any thoughts moving in here. The equipment fails, not only cameras, guns, but oil pumps, TVs, cars, trucks, motorcycles, ships, bulldozers, generators, planes, helicopters. And people talk about, where is the physical evidence? Well, that's physical evidence. All of these things have been stopped in their tracks. And we have multiple witnesses to these things. We have the disappearance of ambient sound. You're out in your backyard and a UFO lands near you. Suddenly there's no crickets. You can't hear the cows mooing. There's no sounds on the highway. You can't hear the wind. You can't hear anything. I think it could be because the sound is actually out of the audible range. A 1962 case just came to light in the June 1993 MUFON UFO Journal. The occupants told a seminary student, quote, that noise in the vicinity was in an altered state of suspension and even time was altered. This is what the people aboard the thing told the guy, the witness. Objects float up from the ground. We had abductees who float up from the ground, sometimes through their walls. You've probably heard of the Linda Cortila case in New York, where a woman was floated out through her 12th story Manhattan apartment window, or not through the open window, but through the glass, and taken into a ship. You probably heard of the allegation abductions where 4 men were floated up from a canoe. The Washburn family in Australia, which one person was taking a photograph of another one, and during that time, before he could click the shutter, he was frozen in time. People were floated up from the beach into this craft and went through a long, involved abduction scenario and brought down in between the time he clicked the shutter. During this, a lot of people feel weightless. They say it's like being in an elevator that's falling quickly. They can feel that they don't have any, gravity is abrogated. Their voices are even distorted. One case, the Nicholl family in Australia, they were taken up in their car, and while they were taken up, of course, the woman is yelling at her son, to get out of here. And her voice was real high and screechy, real like when you inhale helium. And she couldn't understand why. I said we had cars and trucks. There was one case where a guy is leading a horse by a bridle. UFO comes down, makes a pass, and turns away, and the horse is taken up into the air, and the guy had to let go of the bridle because the horse is up in the air. I don't know whatever happened to that horse. I think they probably ate it. We have cases where dirt is when one of these things leaves suddenly instead of rising and then going away like they normally do. When they leave suddenly from the ground, sometimes they pull up craters of dirt, and inside the hole is wider at the bottom than it is at the top, and there's little rootlets hanging in there, completely undisturbed, but all the dirt's out here. In some cases, there could be what they call earth cookies. There's a 20-foot section of dirt a foot deep, and it's laid over like this. We don't have any way to do that, but this happens with UFOs. How are we doing on time? Fine, okay. We have water that is affected. There's one case where a guy was out on a beach, and he saw the ocean start to bubble up like this, and there were colored lights coming up through this thing. And he could see all different colors, and the ocean just mounted up like this and went away, and it never was close to the ship. It was around like the fire. It was at some distance away from the ship. He could see the water dripping off like this, and the ship never got wet. It never touched the water. It had been under the ocean. It came up and then it flew away. This is a big thing, like 100 feet in diameter. Let's see here. The clocks, I talked about clock stopping. Now this is not only wristwatches and clocks that can be magnetized, not only electric clocks, but mechanical clocks, and even old antique brass clocks. There's one guy who had a whole collection of clocks, and there wasn't a piece of steel in it. It couldn't be magnetized. Nevertheless, every one of the clocks in his collection stopped. So I think it's a temporal effect, not an electromagnetic effect. Dr. Rem Dr. Rem Varlamov in Russia has been studying these things for years now, and he's taken to placing identical quartz timepieces inside and outside the landing sites, like the one Tom showed you. He finds that the ones inside the landing sites actually run faster than the ones outside. So there's some kind of a temporal effect that is actually residual. It stays there after the UFO is even gone. I talked about abductees at age 5 days and 15 minutes. One case was a Chilean soldier. He left his group of men. It was at night. He saw a purple UFO, and he went towards this thing to challenge it, and he disappeared. And his men didn't know what to do, so they just kind of stayed where they were. And 15 minutes later, this guy showed up again, but he had a 5-day growth of beard, and his calendar watch said it was 5 days later. I know it sounds crazy, but we have multiple witnesses to that. There was another case, a Chinese soldier. He was taken for a period of hours. He was taken for a period of days, and when he came back, he was old, he had a long white beard, and his memory was completely gone. We have speedometers that fluctuate. One guy was driving in a car with 2 other witnesses. His speedometer suddenly changed from 60 to 100 miles an hour, just like this. He looked outside, the scenery was going along just like it should, but nevertheless, he had this problem with the speedometer. He never had any trouble before or since, only when the UFO was there. Next slide. Oh, this is the allegation abductions. Things move in slow motion. There's one case where 3 boys were out in the woods somewhere, and they saw this landed UFO, and they were hesitant, but they got up enough courage to go up and tap on the thing with a flashlight. It moved or made some kind of noise, and it scared them, and they started to run away. And all three of the boys separately said, we were running in slow motion when they tried to run away from this thing. There's one case, a local gentleman was hunting. He was hunting quail, I believe, with a bird dog. The dog was out stalking, and the dog started to move in slow motion. This dog wasn't just stalking game, he was moving in slow motion. They looked up, and up above the dog was a saucer. When the saucer left, the dog started moving normally. In the Bentwaters case, these were American soldiers who were waiting for a UFO to form. Someone knew where it was going to be and when. They had set up lights and cameras around this clearing, and they told these guys to wait there. And this thing formed right in front of their eyes, and it came and landed there. And as these guys are walking between the lights and the UFO, they would take a step, and then their shadows would take a step. Their shadows would cast on the UFO. And they would take another step, and then their shadows would take another step. So, obvious temporal anomaly there. Speeding cars have been stopped within inches. There's one case where a guy was driving 70 miles an hour, and he sees this UFO, and he starts to veer over the center line, and before he knows what's happening, he's going to hit another car that's coming, its highway speeds the other direction. The other guy knew it too. They both closed their eyes, and when they woke up, one guy was sitting in his car, the other guy was standing outside his car. There were no skid marks. The cars were stopped within inches of each other, and the UFO was gone. We had planes and helicopters moved around. Tom showed you the Commander Coyne case where the helicopter, Commander Coyne had thrown the collector in a down position as far as it would go to make that helicopter dive to avoid a collision with a UFO. Even though it was in the down position for several minutes, when the UFO finally left, they were 3,500 feet higher than they had been when the thing had started. They were inside some kind of a field. This has happened with airplanes. One man was a pilot flying alone. His airplane, suddenly all the engines quit. And it was this way for several minutes. Plenty of time for him to fall and hit the earth. But he didn't. He stayed at the same altitude the whole time. After the UFO left, his engines came back on and he flew normally. He was encased in some kind of a field. Slide, please. You've all heard about the crop circles. Next slide. We've never really made the connection between crop circles and UFOs, even though we think there probably is one. But as you see, the grass is bent at the growth nodes. Now this can happen normally when there is no crop circle. This can happen, but it takes months to happen. In a crop circle, this is what happens. This is what lays the grass over, or corn or wheat or whatever it is. Apparently it grows faster on the outside of this bin than on the inside. It's kind of like the little plant, the Venus flytrap that catches flies. The way that thing closes on a fly is out here at the hinges. The cells actually grow fast enough to make it close. Well, that's how fast this stuff is growing in one of these crop circles. So, in other words, the growth is speeded up hundreds or thousands of times faster than normal. So, again, a temporal anomaly. Now, I want to show you a little bit of videotape. You've been watching that snow on that screen for a long time. Can we turn the slide off and show a little videotape here? How am I doing on time? I'm just going to show you a couple of minutes of this that is kind of stuck together, and then I'm going to go back and play it real slow. This is from Messengers of Destiny. I'll tell you about this guy. I'm going to go back and show this slower.
Perhaps rotating on its own axis. Materialize to compare the segments taken from Mr. A.U. in Mexico City with a closer view, allowing us to see details previously obscured. This is not a star, it is not a balloon, nor is it a recognizable aircraft. It is indeed an unknown, a corona like we have not seen before. Studios, some thought it was an unknown intelligence carrying out a scientific mission similar to what our scientists were doing at that same time, measuring and monitoring. If they were seen, so what? The Air Force and no one else would challenge them. Others believed it was indeed a fulfillment of the ancient prophecy.
Excellent. Just to get acoustic detail, you can see the physical shape, but then you also see that I think I see now a disturbance on this side of the craft, indicating that the field generated by the craft are actually disturbing the space surrounding it. This is one analogous to the aircraft. For example, as an aircraft propellant rotates, it disturbs the air around it. That we will operate. So there's a pulsation in the size and geometry of the object. And again, of a repetitive cyclic mode that you expect for the field propulsion system. So one can see that there is strong energetic activity occurring throughout this region. But also we just see a black body and nothing else. That is extremely interesting. These are two things that field propulsion. The phenomena you see here is indicative of an electric field propulsion system. For example, that's what we call electricity. It's actually caused by the motion of the magnetic field through the atmosphere with it. So the color indicates that the different intensities of the field that surround the ship. The radiation pressure at the different regions throughout the ship. These characteristics are magnetic fields. So one might speculate that an electromagnetic device is actually causing the pulsation formation of these fields. I'm one of the scientists that is trying to develop the advanced spaceships to have these kind of capabilities. So this is very exciting for me. Right now we do not know how to develop effective field propulsion systems. So we know enough to know what has to take place for effective field propulsion to continue. And each craft and the signatures of them are exactly what we think an effective field propulsion craft will have. So this is very exciting to people like myself because to tell us that it would be possible. Someone in the Cardinal and Mountains has already met this challenge and hopefully we'll be on this planet and we will as well.
Okay, I'm going to roll this back and tell you a little bit about that tape. Whoops. Am I rolling it back? I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. This tape was put out by Lee and Britt Elders. They have a company called Genesis 3. You can buy the tape. This is a videotape that was made in Mexico City on July 11th, 1991. I'll show you some of these field effects that I was talking about. We're going to see what they call a hypergem, and I think you want to watch the TV rather than the big screen. I think it'll be a little bit better quality that way. Oh, I got it. First, we're going to see this hypergem. You want to watch in the upper right-hand portion of the screen. Can we get the sound on? So I can talk. Watch the upper right-hand portion.
1:22 p.m.
Okay. Did you see that thing jump? Okay, now watch the thing. Can you see the area around the ship? It appears like there was a disturbance in the area.
Allowing us to see details previously obscured. This is not a...
Ah, there we go. There we go. See it changing shape. Now I think in the next few frames we're going to see some of the coloring effects underneath the ship. Nope. I think you saw a little bit of it, but not very much there. Anyhow, you get some idea from that and you can buy this tape and do it yourself and stop it and roll it back and forth real slowly. And you can see a lot of detail in this. There are some people who claim that they have direct knowledge of these devices that warp space-time. Bob Lazar, you may have heard of. He talks about working for the government in Nevada at a place called S4 near Las Vegas. He says that he was one of the people who was trying to reverse engineer a captured flying saucer. He says that they have at least nine that he knows of out there that they keep there in a dugout sort of hangar. They were trying to figure out how they worked so they could build one. He says that they found out that these things have what they call a gravity wave generator. He says they use an element, 115, they bombard it with protons to produce a gravity wave that warps space-time around the craft. He was asked recently, and I'm quoting from the MUFON UFO Journal, October 1993, he was asked, Bob, if you had a craft with a gravity propulsion device aboard and you were to intensify the gravity field around the craft, could it cause light to bend around it in such that the craft would be cloaked from view? Lazar says, yeah, it does. He said, if you're under it, viewing, it depends on where you're viewing it from. If you're directly under the craft, you see the sky above it. So as I said, apparently you can bend the light around this field. Contactee Fred Bell says that he has learned, I gather through his contacts, I've never met the man, he says he's learned how to build one of these things, these devices that warp space-time. Al Bielek says that he was involved in a thing called the Philadelphia Experiment. Back in 1943, the Navy did some experiments where they tried to make a ship, the USS Eldridge, invisible to radar. The ship disappeared and then came back later. According to Bielek, the reason it disappeared is they were doing some other experiments in 1983, and somehow they accidentally formed some kind of a wormhole effect. The ship went 40 years into the future and came back. I know that sounds crazy, I know it does, but Bielek is not the only person who says this happened. There are other people. If we can see the slides here again. Next slide. Next. There's Al Bielek. Next slide. These two books, the one on the left is written by Al Bielek and Brad and Sherry Steiger. The Philadelphia Experiment and Other Conspiracies. This was published by Inner Light in 1990. The one on the right is the Montauk Project by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon, published by Skybooks in 1992. The Montauk Project was supposedly the project in 1983 that the ship went to, and they had to take steps to send it back. According to Bielek, there were alien beings involved. He said that they had a big underground installation in Montauk, and there were several different kinds of aliens in that installation teaching human beings how to do this. We don't know if it's true or not. We only have the words of a few people. Every one of these people, Bielek, Nicholl, Carl Allen, and some of the others, every one of them are the first to tell you they have been brainwashed by the government, so they don't know if their memories are correct or not. But there have been dozens of ufologists who have suggested that time travel might explain UFOs, including Wilbur Smith, A.G. Cadman, Adrian Cox, Rene Floer, Linda Seebach, and Alice Bryant, Raymond Fowler, Dr. Jacques Vallée, Whitley Strieber, Jenny Randalls, and in the August 1993 issue of the MUFON UFO Journal, William Hamilton says, "Another idea that impressed me strongly under hypnosis was that the missing time or missing memory state was caused by a phase shift in time." He says the time frequency in the field of this object was not in sync with our normal Earth time frequency, giving us a conscious gap in memory. And experiencers tell me, and I'm going to leave you with this, I'm just going to play some audio tape here of experiencers and what they actually say they've been told by the people on board these ships. The first voice you're going to hear is Leah Haley. Can we have the next slide? And Leah has written a book called "Loss Was the Key" about this. She says that they used an analogy of a slinky. They said time was like a slinky, that little child's toy that's like a spring, and it's in loops. And she says they told her that these loops could be all intertwined among themselves and everything else. And you can jump from one loop to another. And so you'll hear what she says about that. And I'm going to go back and change these slides, and I'm going to leave you with this. Just let this audio tape roll.
Things that seem real. One that seemed real, it was very, very strange, but still has too many real aspects of it. And I think that it would be really interesting to find out what really happened here under hypnosis, but I've not investigated this yet. One of these realistic type dreams I had was a Back to the Future time dream where I was time traveling. And I'd really be interested in knowing what really happened there. It just felt like too many parts of that dream were real to be just a dream. I don't know if that's some kind of a screen memory or what, but at some point in time I want to examine that. Also in December 1992, you already heard Forrest Crawford tell you that I was kept awake 2 nights in a row being given telepathic messages concerning the spiritual grid of the universe of concentric circles representing the spiritual grid of the universe. I was telepathically taught stuff about polarities and about time. Actually, time. Well, I don't have time to get into that, but if you want to talk to me about it, I'll be glad to, because I find it really interesting. Talking to me about time, they were telling me time's not linear. That's what they were explaining. Time is not linear. Time is no more linear than the Earth is flat. That's what I was told.
I think you've probably heard this before too. They have a time machine. And you probably already know about that, otherwise you wouldn't have written the book, right?
I have deduced that that's how they get here, is by using time travel, by warping space-time. And they've told lots of other contactees and abductees that that's what they do.
They do that. Because I've been, they had some kind of thing that they drank in water, in some kind of fluid. And you'll find out how this works later on, because it all makes sense. And it took me a long time to figure just why this was going on. But they had actually what you call microchips that could be ingested into your whole body. And along with it, also some kind of energy generation system within the microchips or whatever the world they are. I have no idea. And the devices that they ingested. And when you get aboard their ship, if you notice on that, I was in one of their suits. They have to be put in suits. These are electronic plug-in units. The suit goes up over your head. And as you go up and accelerate through time, you need these devices in your body. Because as you approach light speed, your body begins to dissolve. And things get very strange. That's why they also have to be contained in a suit. Now these suits are some kind of special metal, I guess, or some kind of electronic gear all through these. And when you hit light speed, is to keep you from having your atoms spewed across the universe. When you hit light speed also, you don't have any consciousness at all. And part of this is that your memory and whatever you're supposed to do is contained in computers that which are got some kind of magnetic field around them. So, it's true. They do go through time. And of all people, you would just happen to be on the radio there and I heard you. I said, Jesus Christ, I can talk to somebody now. Because I have been teletransported through time and I know what their ships are. I know how they do it.
You've been transported from this time to the future, to the past?
I'd say you can meet yourself coming and going. You could give me enough information to see through time. Literally see through time like a prophet. Now that is something special, even though these creatures are probably the most abusive. Because the time unfolds like a flower. It's fantastic. They give you the information. It just unfolds and things that you never thought would happen all of a sudden happen. And it's quite the experience. And it's quite satisfying to know that some of these things that will happen in the future you might be able to avoid. Like the natural disasters or something like that.
So you have an ability now?
No.
What you did, they let you see.
They have the time machine. They not only travel through time, they also have a machine that they can see through time.
Okay, some of the basics on time. Okay, time is another dimension, just like with our height. And theoretically, one of the things I was proposed to is that there could be beings who also live in, say, like time within height, to the length within height, or whatever. But time itself is not linear. It's constantly happening. It's like looping rings. It's everything that you've ever been or ever will be or ever was, anything at any point of anything that is relevant to time. And from what I've been hearing lately, there are places where there is no even concept of time. But anyway, it's happening all at one time. Each turn the kids before one is that's almost insidious. I'm sorry. I was telling you just before you took from about time and magnetism being directly linked. And one of the reasons I found out about this recently was I was talking to someone about the holographic shift. Maybe I should talk about that right now. I should do that sometime. But time, even as we speak, even though time seems to move forward for us, it isn't necessarily. Now, as far as ETs go, they have control over time, mostly because they're aware that it's nonlinear. If you understand it's nonlinear, you can start using it in nonlinear ways. And even using it in linear ways, they can
correct things. Like, let's say they go see you're abducted on Monday, and you stay with them and you work all the way through till Friday, okay? Now you're with them for 5 days. They bring you back a half hour after they pick you up, okay? So now you wake up this Monday morning again, but now there are two of you because there's one of you at home living that week again, and there's another one of you there living that. And that's why a lot of abductees don't always remember things right away because they have to catch up with their own consciousness, you know. So like, let's say if something happened dramatically on Thursday evening on shipboard, they may not have an idea of anything happening until Thursday evening because of the link. Because even though even though at any given point in time our souls are aware of every other part of us and every other part that we ever have been, we're not always connected with that. And some of the reasons for this connection is that time is not always moving at the same speed. If you want to go back to the idea of time moving, it's not always moving at the same speed in any particular dimension that you happen to be in. By creating, the way it was described to me, I know this is going to sound really stupid, but they use a lot of symbolism, okay? And the way it was, I was described almost in the cafeteria method. Something called peanut butter and jelly theory is what I was described. I was told if you're traveling through peanut butter, if you just picture yourself walking in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you're moving in the peanut butter, you're moving slowly in a particular point of time, in a particular amount of time you move a certain amount of peanut butter. If you jump up into the jelly, you can move much further in the jelly in a particular amount of time and come down in the peanut butter ahead of the time that you would have normally been, and that was back and forth. There's also pockets of time, displacement of time, where it's almost like a pocket or another dimension. Dimensions and realms are constantly crossing over each other. They're like, where you're sitting right now, you might have millions of realms around you. You might have just another one or two or whatever, but you may have millions. And depending on what realm your existence is in, or what realm your frequency is in, will depend on how much time, that was my doorbell, I'm sorry, how much time passes in between, hang on just a second. Okay. Sorry about that, my daughter just came to the phone. Will depend on how much time in a linear sense passes for you. So starting from the seemingly linear sense, the idea of multiple existences in time happening, overlapping envelopes, and the way that would happen, that's the idea of being picked up on a Monday and brought down on Friday. Say they pick you up on a Monday.
I think you get the idea from that. Boy, sorry about that. I didn't know that was going to happen. So anyway, what I'm saying here is that if these beings are able to warp space-time, and I believe they are, this means that they could be coming here not only from other planets, but from other stars, other galaxies, other parallel dimensions that coexist with ours on different planes, and even from our own future or our own past. They may even be coming from places like the place where we go when we dream or when we die. We just don't know, but they could be coming from literally millions of different places, and so they could have literally millions of different agendas. So when people ask me, why are they here? First of all, I can't say who they are, and I don't know why, all the different reasons why they are here. I think some of them may be from our future. They could be coming here for every reason, from historical research, like imagine being able to go back and see the birth of Christ or something. I'm sure we would do it if we could. They could be coming here to escape into the past, to hunt dinosaurs. Who knows how many reasons. It could explain why they look like us, how they're able to interbreed with us, why they come more often on Wednesdays, on July and September and so forth. Those could be like default values, like when you turn your clock radio off and turn it back on, it always says 1 o'clock, the default value. You can explain why they breathe our air and so forth, why they rescue people. I'm almost finished here. Let me have the next slide. You can explain to Men in Black. This is a picture that was of a plaque that was put on the Pioneer spacecraft. This on the left is a depiction of our solar system. See the different length of lines and the little dots and dashes to show how far that is. Next slide. This was from the Voyager spacecraft, the same diagram. Next slide. This was a plaque that was unearthed from ancient Sumerian ruins. You see the same diagram on there. I talked to Richard Hoagland, who made the plaque on the spacecraft. He said, "No, I didn't know that. I didn't know about this thing." But I talked to Zechariah Sitchin, who translated this, and he said, "Oh yeah, as soon as I saw the Pioneer thing, I knew what it was. It was one of these." Sitchin claims that this is a record of when people came here 450,000 years ago. He says that these people are our ancestors. He says that they sort of like created us, not created us, but changed us. We were like very primitive people, and they gave us more intelligence. Now maybe Sitchin's wrong. Maybe God created us just like it says in the Bible. But either way, it appears that somebody now is tampering with our genes. They're trying to change us. And I would propose that maybe one reason for that is that we are destroying this planet and everything on it. We are ruining the ozone layer, and when that's all gone, we won't have any food because crops won't be able to grow. We're causing acid rain and global warming. We're polluting our oceans. We're destroying 3 species a day. We're cutting down all our rainforests. And while we're doing all this, we're demonstrating constantly what vicious creatures we are. I mean, look at what is happening in Bosnia right now, for instance, where people are just murdering each other for no reason at all. And we're right on the verge of going out into space. We're developing nuclear engines for spacecraft now. And when we go out, we could take our nuclear weapons with us. And so regardless of whether we are an experiment of some race, ancient race, or whether God created us, or what it is, if you were outside of this planet looking at us, it would look to you like we have 2 main aims in life. And one is to destroy the planet and everything on it, and the other is to kill each other. And here we are going out there getting ready to go out in space with these weapons. So if I were those people and I were looking at us, I would see myself as having 3 options. One is they could let us destroy everything here. 2 is they could destroy us so that all the other creatures could survive. Or 3 is they could fix us. They could come and they could do something to us again. They could take out that greed that we used to have when we were primitive people. And the person who was the greediest and could gather the most roots was most likely to survive. That's the very thing that's causing us trouble now. Because that's why we're killing each other, and that's why we're destroying the planet. So they can change us. And it appears to me that it's possible that that might be the reason why they've abducted so many people. And the reason I say that is, and I'd like to ask all of you here to call me and talk to me about this. The reason I say that is every abductee that I've talked to, and I've talked to many of them, considers themselves environmentalists. They're worried about the way we treat our planet. They consider themselves a human rights advocate. They don't like the way minorities are treated. And they consider themselves an anti-nuclear advocate. They want to get rid of all the nuclear weapons. Every single one of them. And I haven't studied them all. There may be abductees here that don't feel that way. But it's just a theory that I've come up with. And David Jacobs talks about this during the abduction scenario. He talks about this procedure that's done. The people are lying there, the aliens or whoever they are, the visitors come and get very close to them, within 2 inches of their face, and they stare into their eyes. And during that time, information passes both ways. They say they feel like their minds are being read, and they feel like information is being put in their minds. And they don't know what that information is that's being put in there. They don't have access to it, but they think it's important and they think they're going to use it later on. So maybe that's the reason. There could be, like I say, millions of other reasons. But that's all I have. And I just want to show you the next slide here. This is my newsletter, contact form. I would encourage all of you to read it, to write articles for us. If you have these experiences, write articles and we'll print them. You don't have to use your name. All you have to do, next slide, all you have to do is send the information to this address or call this number, or you can pick up a leaflet about contact form and it has my address and phone number in it. And next slide. Let's all try to keep an open mind. Thank you very much.
And now for the question and answer session, Tom and Mark. I'd like to start it off and then turn it over to you. But the first question I would like to ask Tom. I have a strong interest in a rash of UFO sightings that occurred in the 80s in the Hudson Valley. There's this boomerang-shaped craft that was seen by hundreds of people, traveling in most cases very slow, almost like a glider, but described as big as a football field or even bigger than that. In some cases, witnesses described the boomerang-shaped craft to disappear instantaneously and come back to the same point where it was, or zip across the horizon and back in 2 seconds. It was seen by hundreds of people. Unsolved Mysteries did a big special about it. And I find it very fascinating, it's the size of a football field, Tom. But it seemed as if it wanted to be seen by people. And it was, it seemed to be one style of the UFO, boomerang-shaped craft. Do you have any comments on that or any possible interpretation of what really was going on there?
It'd be just great to sit back here and tell you exactly what happened and why. I really don't have anything except to say that the boomerang shape is what Keith Arnold first saw. His description, and they called them saucers even from that time on, but it looked like, I guess it's almost like a boomerang, although it had two scallops on the trailing edge of it. Now, I think that there's a lot of times, probably Mark can think of some of these, but where 200,000 people would see a UFO. Now, obviously, if they were trying to hide, they certainly wouldn't pick that place to hide. So anything from 500 to 1,000. Well, for example, just down here in Columbus, Kansas, and I would say about two years ago, the sheriff down there, he said that more people in town saw it than didn't, which was about 1,200 population in that particular city, Columbus, Kansas. So, and the same thing has apparently occurred over in Gulf Breeze. They think that there are more people there have seen them than didn't. So I don't think there's any way you can make anything special.
Yeah, I think they're getting much bolder than they were for a while. I talked about the Mexico City, the solar eclipse in July 11th, 1991. Brett Elders told me that since that time, the UFOs have never left Mexico City. They're seen there almost daily over large areas where you got to remember there are 20 million people living there. And so they're seen by hundreds of thousands of people almost daily. They now have collected more than 700 videotapes of these things, a lot of them in daylight, some of them very close. And even though we don't hear a word about it in our press, it is happening there all the time now. In fact, she said that large groups of people will stop their cars and get out and lie on the hoods and watch these things overhead and cheer when they go over. And she says it sounds like, somebody's watching a football game. And when you hear the cheers, you go out and you see the UFOs. Instead of watching TV at night, these people sit on their porches and invite their neighbors over to watch the UFOs. So they are getting much bolder. If you think this phenomenon is going to go away, I think my answer would be you can run but you can't hide, because I think they're making themselves known. They're doing it gradually in such a way that so as not to panic us, but they're making themselves known. And the evidence, as we showed you, is just overwhelming. There are so many books and articles and videotapes and photographs now that there's just the cover-up is ridiculous now. So they are getting bolder.
I've had people always, when I started to say something about it, but that say, hey, I don't see anything in the newspapers. Well, if you subscribe to one of these clipping services, which I did for a while, but I was running out of money because it was running about 200, anywhere from 150 to 200 newspaper clippings a month. Now, that's a lot of clippings.
Is that worldwide?
No, usually just all English-speaking countries.
Oh, and Lou Farish, the man who runs the clipping service, I asked him one time, I said, how is it that you're able to fit all those different size clippings on that paper and get them just right? And he says, I only put the ones that fit. He says, the New York Times says we print all the news that's fit to print. And he says, I print all the news that fits. So there's a lot more than just those few articles that we see. And also, I've never seen one about the Mexico City stuff in that bunch. So even though it's in their newspapers every day, they're not getting up to here. And the reason is, I think, is because the wire services have orders not to carry the stories. The major networks, they just have orders not to carry the stories. They don't want to panic people. People in Mexico are not afraid of UFOs, but a lot of people up here are. So they don't want to panic us.
In relation to the press really suppressing all this information, it really seems that there's a worldwide agreement among governments to suppress this information. And both you gentlemen have had experience with the suppression of information, and there seems to be a growing community of people who are aware of it. My question is, I'm still trying to fathom what the real motivator is for governments to suppress it. And maybe they think there are some deleterious impact on the society, but it's hard for me to judge what you think.
I think they're worried about themselves, the governments themselves. For one, for example, let's just suppose that tomorrow morning, hey, everybody found out that we were not really in control. We don't have any power. They have the power. We don't. We're just sitting here at their mercy. What would happen to your money? What would happen to the people supplying food? What would happen to anything? Would we be able to get any products? Would we be able to continue to live? Would our governments, would we pay taxes to our government? These are some nasty things that might occur. And aside from the fact that it's going to tangle a lot of people with their religions are going to shake them up, perhaps. So I don't know that. I think there may be many good reasons, and I've only touched on a couple of them. Maybe you've thought of some other too.
I think it's possible that the cover-up. The question was, what's the motivation for the government cover-up and the cover-up in the press? I think it may have started even before this, but it started in a big way, I think, in 1947 on July 2nd, when the UFO crashed in the New Mexican desert, and it crashed very near the only atomic bomb group in the world. This is where the only atomic bomb, the 509th bomb wing, was stationed. And this was right after World War II, and we were still real jumpy about security and everything. And I think that they probably made the right decision to keep it under wraps at that time, because I think it would have panicked people. But I think it has become almost a religion with some people within our government now. And I think that the secrecy thing has gotten completely out of hand, and they really don't know how to handle it, because as Tom said, the implications, I was telling someone a while ago, what would happen if one of these things landed on the White House lawn tomorrow and all the major networks covered it? Half the people in the country, half the people in the world wouldn't even go to work the next day because they'd be home watching TV to see what the aliens were going to do. The stock market would go crazy. I mean, just imagine if you were proven, it was proven to you that you could have a crafter that could travel faster than the speed of light. Why would you build trains and cars and airplanes and stuff like that anymore? If it was proven to you that these people have the ability to stop any wars, on this planet, why would we build war machinery anymore? Why would we have an oil-based economy anymore when we learn all this free energy stuff that they're using? So, our stock market would go to hell in a handbasket, I think, right away. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It affects everything throughout civilization, I think.
I have a friend whose daughter lives in Belgium in town, and she says there that they accept UFOs just as they evidently are in Mexico City. They're public service. The police will study them, and they're not. Nothing's happening over there toward the economy. They have strikes like they do everywhere else. But that's one country that is different.
Well, they've certainly made a lot of studies and worked on it, but I think that it's kind of, as far as I can tell, that they quieted down pretty good after, 6 months or so, hasn't it, since that came up?
Yeah, their president, I don't think, has come out on the newscasts and said this is really happening. I think, if you had something like that, or if you had a real demonstration like in the city square or something like that, you might have some panic. But the way it's being handled there, the thing is, the way the cover-up is handled, it isn't that the governments don't want us to know that this is going on. It's that they don't want us to know too much too soon. In fact, I believe there is an education program underway right now. And our government is purposely leaking information through all forms of media. Have you seen the Camel cigarette advertisement? That with a picture of an alien, it says they're here. It doesn't even say smoke Camels. It doesn't have anything about cigarettes on it. So why are they doing it? And I think it's part of the government education program. If you watch the X-Files on TV and they inject these little things into the story that interrupts the story instead of helping the story along, it stops the action to inject this information. Well, I think it's being done on purpose to educate us gently. Tell us, just bring us along gently. And we, the people in this room, these are the people who are ready for the information. And we're getting it. We can get all we can read for a lifetime. It's there. The people who are not ready for the information do not believe it's happening. And the government doesn't want them to believe it's happening until they're ready. I think that's what's happening.
I think we have a problem with the 20 million Americans that don't believe we've been to the moon.
Yeah.
Now, when we have 20, they don't think we've been there, why? How are you going to even talk to them about space? Somebody had a question here.
Yeah, I asked you a question earlier about why don't they appear now. I think that the rest of the world seems to be ready for it, and this is the best call ever. But the only ones who's not prepared is the United States.
You might be right.
And the only one that really needs outside the United States is Bosnia, like you said. Well, anything to prevent what's going on is a miracle to them. So with the U.S., we mentioned that it'll stop our economy and it'll stop taxes. That's even greater. That's even better, because isn't money the concept of our downfall? And I think before we used to live with not really one race, but all the races were kind of intertwined, and nothing really separated us. We all lived in harmony. It was our
too many racism going on that we can't even go any further.
There's going to be a lot of people who starve because they're not going to know how to go out there in the farm and survive.
Well, their consciousness would probably turn on eating also. And
what was that?
People's consciousness would probably turn into one. I mean, what I'm trying to say is, they probably wouldn't go into riots like you were saying before, or any. You know,
I'd like you to when you're thinking about, you mentioned racism, I think. I've seen situations myself where one person killed another person. I mean, I didn't see it personally, but I've seen it on television and so forth, where one person killed another person because they had a different kind of haircut. I mean, you know, we have a terrible problem with racism all over the world. And Bosnia is a good example of that. These people are actually, there's no difference at all between these people except their religious beliefs. And even those aren't that far apart. And they think that each of those three groups thinks that every one of the other people in the other groups ought to be slaughtered. They call it ethnic cleansing. All right, now, you bring an alien into the situation. Now, this guy doesn't, you know, he doesn't even have any hair at all. His haircut is really different. Well, how do you think people on this planet are going to treat these people? I mean, we have demonstrated at every chance, we have shot at them with guns, BB guns, we've thrown rocks at them, and our governments have shot missiles, you know, high-powered, like TOW missiles and Phoenix missiles at these things. Naturally, they blew up before they ever got there because they hit that field, whatever it is. But we've demonstrated at every opportunity that we don't like these people and that we're going to try to kill them first and then ask questions later. And I'm not sure that they have anything to gain from us because obviously their technology is far, far advanced from ours. And so, you know, why would they want to come down and you know, help us like that? I also think that some of them may be from our own future. And so anything that they do back here in the past is going to affect us. And because of that, it can affect them maybe. So I think they maybe have to be real careful as to how they do things like that. In the back?
Well, is there any validity to this theory, or some authors put forward this theory that there was negotiations in trade for technology for human experimentation or freedom to take some of the population, a percentage of the population, and conduct experiments, etc. Is there any validity to that theory?
The only evidence I know to support that theory that there's been an agreement between either aliens or some kind of visitors and our government, the only evidence I know of is the fact that our government knows about it and won't tell us. I don't have any, you know, I've never been there and seen it happening, or I've never seen the documents or anything like that. But why won't they tell us? They know it's happening. So maybe that is some evidence.
I don't think that we have the evidence. I don't think we have the proof of that. Although we hear this, I think it's been in so many papers and so many people have said that this is a fact. Shoot, if it was done, that was back in the late 40s, I would guess.
Well, it's a negotiation gone sour, apparently.
Well,
I mean,
that's
theory,
a lot of...
That's why we've been shooting missiles and trying to retaliate after the fact.
Perhaps.
We don't know.
We're not there. Anybody else?
What is the Majestic 12?
A few years ago, a movie producer named Jamie Chandray got a roll of film in the mail, and his friend William Moore came over and they developed it, and it had a document on it saying that it was a briefing document from the Truman administration for President Eisenhower to tell him about the Roswell, well, it didn't say the Roswell, it said that a saucer had been captured and that there were bodies aboard it, a crash saucer, and that there were bodies aboard it, and that they were studied, and it named 12 individuals who were in charge of this project of studying it to find out everything they could about it. The 12 individuals, Dr. Vannevar Bush, I'm not sure who they all were, James Forrestal. It turns out that every one of those individuals was a person who would be a logical choice for that. So it was thought by a lot of people that maybe these documents could be real, but if they're real, why were they sent in that form? So that you couldn't check the paper, you couldn't check the ink. There's been an awful lot of controversy about it. Stanton Friedman was here a few weeks ago and he told in great detail about that controversy. He believes the documents are genuine and he's a very good researcher. A lot of other people think that they're bogus. I have a tendency to be somewhere in the middle. I think they're disinformation. This is only an opinion, I don't have evidence for this. But the way disinformation works is you put a lot of good information in there and you put some bad information in there too. And so whenever people find the bad information, they disregard all of it, including the good information, and it defuses the situation. So that if you had the press that was just about ready to find out that this was true, then they could effectively defuse that situation, because now you can't get a reporter from the New York Times or anybody else to look at this because they point out the things that are inconsistent in this document and say it must be forged. So we really don't know about that either.
We have time for about 3 more questions.
There was one over here.
I just had one, Mark, in relationship to supposedly there have been these aliens or other life forms that have crashed and died or even have been alive before you. Have you had contact with any type of medical people in your research that have talked about their internal structure? I'm curious about whether they are.
I have
anything documented or you've heard anything.
Yeah, there's documented stuff. I haven't personally been in touch with any of the doctors myself. Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt and Stanton Friedman and Don Berliner have all been in direct contact with people who say that they've seen the bodies, they've worked on them, they've touched them, and they even have some drawings and stuff. There are something like 200 or 300 now witnesses to this Roswell incident where these things were recovered.
Leonard Stringfield, who has written several books, and he lives in Cincinnati, and his sister was dying, and the sister who worked with at Wright Air Base for all of her life, and she was dying, and she said, I want you to know about this, and there are pictures that I have taken or I've gotten hold of, and they were Polaroid pictures of EVs or aliens that they had kept in the glass containers, and that supposedly, well anyway, her sister, who lived, and of course the one died, got a hold of Len Stringfield. And I saw him, and he showed me the pictures, the Polaroids of the bodies. That's all I can say. I mean, he couldn't say anything more. There's nothing more that he couldn't prove anything more than that, but here it was. Just exactly everything we've been told.
Did they look like what some of these pictures?
Yep, exactly. The large eyes and the 4 fingers and pointed things, everything just like in gray, and of course they're dead. They're going to be grayer, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that you saw what you saw, but I just want to hear how you would address Carl Sagan's theory that, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, that 100 years ago, it was very common that everyone believed in ghosts and spirits. And there were thousands of people that claimed that they saw them and heard them and were possessed by them, and it was a common belief at that time, and there was millions of people who said that they saw it, and so now he's saying that this phenomenon is similar to that, just in a new time frame. And why would Carl Sagan say that, and what do you think that is?
Well, Fred, one thing Carl Sagan and I wouldn't get along very well.
Right.
Because he spent all his time talking about extraterrestrials and the search for them. And and spent and I don't know how many millions of dollars we spent on his equipment and what he thinks is the way to go about it. And I don't agree with it. We know that they're right next door. What are we spending all this kind of? I think it's just a boondoggle on his part.
About the ghosts, I have an answer for that. Ghosts exist, and I think that's why people saw them and said they saw them. Now, I think maybe some people went a little overboard on it, and they really got caught up in the moment. And spiritualists were trying to, get people's money, and so they hold these seances and have these fake things and all that. It's sure there was a lot of fakery involved, but people see ghosts all the time now. Millions of people have seen
Sure,
them.
but I'm talking about the more common, being possessed by demons, and that was a very common belief that everybody thought.
Yeah, being possessed by demons.
Right.
Well, some abductees and contactees today it might be interpreted that way as being possessed by demons. I mean, they hear voices and these voices tell them to do certain things, and so it's a difference in a way of looking at it, but it's still going on now. It went on then. It went on thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, and UFOs were seen thousands of years ago. We have stone carvings of them from thousands of years ago, and they're classics, flying saucers. As far as Carl Sagan is concerned, I think Carl Sagan is working for the government. He is the spokesman for the cover-up. He gets an article in Parade magazine, which goes out to 40,000 readers anytime he wants it. 40 million readers, I'm sorry. Anytime he wants it. And he knows that, and he's very careful about what he says. Carl Sagan knows the evidence. He's been exposed to it. He knows it's there. And nevertheless, he draws the ridiculous conclusion that these are all hallucinations. And at the same time, he is supporting the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which is ridiculous. Why are we looking a million light years away at the edge of the known universe when these things are landing in our backyard? So I think Carl Sagan is the new member of this MJ-12, or whatever it is. I think he took Dr. Donald Menzel's place when Menzel died. And there's a lot of evidence to support that.
Time for one more question.
On this time theory, you're talking about how stars will warp time, machinery warps time, people's minds warp time. So how do you figure with the machinery requiring a lot of energy and people being able to go forward into time with just their thoughts, or are the little people affecting them or having something to do with this?
I think the question, as I understand it, I was talking in my talk about how the presence of matter warps the space-time continuum, and the more mass there is, the greater the curvature, so the more warping there is. And I was hypothesizing that these people who are in these UFOs have figured out a way to make a machine to do that artificially, and that possibly some of them can even do it mentally, telekinetically with their minds. And I think your question was, if they can do it with their minds, where does all that energy come from? We're being told now, the gentleman that you saw on my videotape who was looking at the TV and explaining that this is a vorticity, this is Dr. David Froning. He's a field propulsion engineer. He's trying to figure out how to do this. He has told me, and others have told me, other physicists, that our universe is full of energy. I mean, energy is everywhere, tremendous amounts of energy, and it's available. They call it zero-point energy or free energy, and it's available only if you know how to use it, but it's there, it's everywhere. And if people are able to do this with their minds, I think they're probably utilizing that somehow. I don't know how, but they're utilizing that energy to allow them to change their vibrational rate or somehow to warp space-time. But I don't know, it's all speculation on my part. I mean, I don't know how it works. I don't think anybody knows how it works.
Okay, if these little guys that crashed in the desert, if they were killed, and they knowing how or what is happening, why could they not have avoided the accident? Or could someone else go back into time and pick them up before they had the accident?
I don't know. If they've really landed here 3 million times, as Jacques Vallée believes, then I think they've got a pretty good record. They've only crashed about 18 times, and that's better than, I think that's probably better than our own flight record. And you got to remember that these are extremely complicated, high technology vehicles that are only here. They're only staying in our universe because of this field. And if anything happens to that field, anything at all, if lightning strikes it or something, it could cause them to be marooned here in this time period. And it could unleash tremendous amounts of energy. The Tunguska crash, the Tunguska explosion in Siberia back in, I think it was 1908, may have been one of these things crashing. It was like a nuclear blast,
Okay, but the only thing I can add to it is that several people that I've talked to about this have said that there is a tendency for them to have a problem of stability. That they get in certain situations, the stability is not the best. They have trouble predicting it.
Third Eye Productions would like to thank Mark and Tom for a great, stimulating evening. I'd like to thank you for coming to this event. There's going to be more events. Please sign the list, and we'll keep you informed of all future activities, including the birthday party, first birthday party at the end of February. We'll have a panel of abductees. Let's have a great round of applause.